This is a panel I've really been looking forward to, because given what we've been talking about this afternoon, the themes we've been exploring, speaking truth to power and educating our regulators, our governing bodies, is really important. And it wasn't just what Lord McNichol said over lunch, but in his speech, but what he said over lunch informally, which convinces me that this is unusually an issue that is quite bipartisan. I don't think there is a discernible divide between what the present Conservative government want to do and what a possibly incoming Labour government might want to do. And so there's a great opportunity for this sector to talk to government. So we're going to hear from two people uniquely placed to tell us how that works, how that should be done, what's good and what's bad. Now, forgive me, Matt, I'm going to start with Albert. And I'm going to start with Albert because, as we heard earlier, Gibraltar, jurisdiction I know well and have a huge amount of time for, it was all over DLT regulation as far back as 2017. One of the first jurisdictions to do that. And you were right at the pointy end of that process as Minister for Finance. So who spoke truth to you?
I think the advantage of all small jurisdictions is that you're close to the sector. You're close to the constituents, and you're talking to people all of the time. And the advantage we had was that we had people that were interested in talking to us about it with the regulator. So we sat around a table with the private sector, the regulator, and the government. We set up a working group. It took 2 years to come back with some proposals. We considered setting up a new regulator just for digital assets. We looked at how we could regulate it. And we came to the conclusion that I mentioned this morning that on going on 9 core principles, which eventually became 10, when we included the adoption of a market manipulation core principle. Now, what pushed us to do it was we were only interested in it if we could protect our reputation, which is critical to us, and we could do it in a way that secured, like we did with online gaming 25 years ago, minder management in Gibraltar, fully regulated, so there's no chance that we can allow anyone to do this in an unregulated space, and with the presence that they had to have in Gibraltar for us to be able to regulate them. If they're not there, you can't really realistically regulate them. And so the process ended up with us adopting core financial services principles, blended with the discretion of the regulator to adapt and implement those principles. And we published the legislation in 2017, became effective on the 1st of January 2018. But it was only because of the comfort that the private sector gave us that we had the courage to do it, because we were the first people ever to do it.
And how did that work? Did you, and we all know how statutory consultations work, but did you have people into the office to talk to them about what they thought would work and wouldn't work in Gibraltar?
Well, critical to all of this was the regulator. We had to get the regulator comfortable with what we were proposing, because if they would have said to me, don't do it, I wouldn't have done it. I did it because they said, we can do this, and we can do this safely. And that's what we've got to. None of our firms that have been licensed since 2018 have had any regulatory licenses suspended. It hasn't happened. And we haven't got 100, let's be clear. We've got, I think, 15 or 16 licenses granted as DLT firms. So the work that we did in preparation for it, with the regulator and the private sector, was effective, and it worked. It provided us with a safe environment for these companies to innovate within the realms of what we did. So AML, number 1 on the list, corporate governance, number 2 on the list, fitness and propriety, capital, business plan, the basic things borrowed from the toolkit of financial services and applied to this sector. And for us, it's worked well.
So, Matt, I'm absolutely fascinated to get your insight, because being sort of the heart of government, when you were Minister for Digital, what was helpful to you from the sector, from the private sector? What kind of interaction did you get real benefit from?
Well, the most important thing is rigorous truth-telling from the sector inwards. I'm going to tell you that the most frustrating thing was people being too polite. And I get this now that I'm not in government, but still in Parliament. I come to sessions like this and people are frustrated with the regulators and, and people express what they really think of the FCA to me. And then often you'll then get them into the process with the regulator and it's much more gentle and kid gloves. It's actually terrific that we've got both the Bank of England and the FCA here today and really, really smart people on this. Yeah. Because truth unto power, of course, on the power side, if you like, on the regulatory government side, you've got to be open and listening, but you actively seek that engagement. You want to know what's going to work. And in the UK, to give the bank and the FCA their dues, we only just changed the legal framework. It's less than a year since that went through. And they have to operate in the legal framework. It was up to the government end to get the legal structures through first, and we did. And now I do think there's a huge opportunity for London and for the UK. But it's now, the ball's been passed down to Threadneedle Street and Stratford, and they need to be open and encouraging of that honest interaction.
Do you think that sort of over-deference, that politeness, is just because we're British, or do you think it was just a sort of holding government in awe? I mean,
no, it's neither of those two things. Certainly not the second.
No.
I actually think in some cases it's because people worry that if they're too robust, then they've got their own license to get, right? So you're kind of looking over your shoulder because you may not want to be quite so robust in case they come back and say, well, we don't like that. This is where the industry bodies are incredibly important, but then industry bodies are amazing, but they are at one step removed from the actual people who are actually trying to get their regulatory clearance through. And so I just encourage people to be really direct, really engage, and just not assume that the regulator's out to get you. I understand why it feels like that, but that is frustrating on the other side of the fence as well.
I think I know the answer to my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyhow. I get the impression that as minister, you wouldn't want to deal with lobbyists, for example. You want to deal with the person who has the issue that needs resolving.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes the lobbyist can help to frame it in a way that is constructive from the policy side, because there is a different language. Business and policy are sometimes in different languages. But really, you want the person who's trying to get whatever it is through. And there's nearly always a good reason on the other side of the fence. I'm now sounding like a total apologist, which is not how I feel. But it is but there's normally a good reason for why things are going at the pace they are. There is no bigger champion for the UK having a very strong digital assets framework than me. But I also was involved in drafting the report, the Sassoon report, that became the current regulatory structure, financial regulatory structure, the separation between the bank and the invention of the Financial Policy Committee and the FSA becoming the FCA. I basically drafted that paper. And in doing so, we knew that one of the challenges is, as per the previous panel, that if the regulator always feels that they get a bucket of merd poured over them every time a decision goes wrong, then they're going to become risk averse over time. And how to lean against that is really difficult in policy terms.
Yeah.
So if you're in industry, the answer is, if something goes wrong, don't blame the regulator, right? If something goes wrong, we find out if it actually is wrong or if it's just one company going bust. It was actually, I was just explaining, it was me who came up with the phrase that we don't seek the stability of the graveyard. And I'm glad George picked up on it and ran with it. But the point there is that you have to give regulators the permission to allow for some companies to go wrong and some things to fail. Because if you don't, then you will just get stasis and all the incentives on the regulator are to say no.
So we all know that urgent legislation, I agree, Matt, urgent legislation is nearly always bad legislation. So you get it right, take your time to get it right. And whilst there's an imperative to get on with things, particularly for the UK and the US, given what we were talking about this morning, you have to get it right. So Gibraltar, I think it's fair to say, has broadly got it right. And it's now a real hub for this sector, given its size and its infrastructure. So, what truth would you speak to the UK, who are further behind the curve at the moment?
Well, I think in Gibraltar, I think the private sector is polite to the regulator, but not so polite to politicians. So we have a slight advantage that we know each other pretty well, so the language is very direct. And you get the feeling pretty quick when you have a feeling that there is an opportunity, and that if managed properly, it can be a good opportunity which will provide a sustainable new line of business for the jurisdiction. So that you take on board. I think the UK is in an incredibly good position to be able to pick up this mantle and run with it in a safe and sustainable way. And I think what Matt has hinted at is that he wished he would have done a little bit more, if I understand what you were saying in terms of the digital asset space. Because for UK to be the forefront of innovation in financial services is where it's always been. It always has. And I think the continuation of that is what everyone in this room is hoping for.
Yeah.
I am surprised at how long it's taken the regulators, and I totally take the point that the last thing you want is a regulator that's scared to make a decision for fear of failure, which then leads to criticism. That is a real problem. So you need regulators, which we do have in Gibraltar and in this country, who are very competent, very confident, and able to make the right calls. And that needs to be fostered. But I think for the UK, and my engagement with Treasury and the regulators, when we talked about not just ELT, but the financial services passporting that Gibraltar does into the UK post-Brexit, which is included in the 2023 Act, all during that time, it was clear to me that there was a will to do more. And I've never really understood, and I have to be honest, why it didn't happen, why there hasn't been a little bit more of an energy. I mean, the sandbox with the Bank of England is great, but I think setting up the AML registration system, now dealing with financial promotions as we have, you've got two of the big keys. Now they need to do the bit in the middle, and I hope that it's done quickly, because it's an incredible opportunity for London.
Yeah.
Well, I think my profession might be partly to blame for that inertia, but...
Well, not entirely. You should. It is those who are making the law who hold responsibility for that. It's true. I wish I'd made further progress on this. I was then made Health Secretary by Theresa May, and I became more famous for that, for better or for worse. But this is where I started, and I started my career in the Bank of England with Rachel Reeves on the same day at the graduate training programme up in the sixth floor in the education centre, and I'm very pleased now. There does appear to be a cross-party consensus, which is very helpful. And there is a desire to make progress. But the thing is, the UK has got to get this right. We have to make the progress, right? London is as it is because we welcomed the Eurobond market in the 80s and we invented repo effectively in the 90s, and we became the global fiat currency trading centre. And this is the big innovation. And digital assets, whatever terminology, and frankly, I don't care, but the digital assets are going to underpin almost everything in finance in the next 5 years, say, to the extent they're not already. The esoteric ideological approach that they grew up with, that was discussed on the last panel, the sort of libertarianism element, is already falling away, and the technology is backing itself right into the core of the payment system. And not before time, if you still try to make a payment to Italy, it can still take 48, 72 hours and cost you a fortune, and this is totally ridiculous because the technology is there to deal with it. The point I'm making is that the UK's role in this is never going to be the pure innovator and the unregulated market, and it shouldn't.
Absolutely.
The UK's role in this is to be the primary, fully regulated market, and that's where we can be. And the Americans, with their effectively retrospective regulation, have now walked off the park. And there's lots of people who'd like to be where we are, but for the UK, if we drop the bit that is also the highly, highly trusted element, then it takes a long, long time to get that bit back. So that's my, I think, a reasonable strategic explanation for learning from the front runners and then going basically as fast as you can, subject to still being a absolutely first-in-class, rock-solid jurisdiction.
So if you were back as Minister for Digital, that's the truth you'd be speaking to government at the moment, to cabinet at the moment.
I think if I was I saw BIM yesterday, as it happens. If I was in BIM's job, because it's a Treasury-led thing rather than a digital or science department now led thing. If I was in BIM's job, I would be saying to the system, go as fast as you possibly can, knowing that the system then slows you down to as fast as is reasonable. You want to go as fast as possible, but no faster. And the but no faster bit is important as well. So as a minister, you've really got to get your shoulder to the wheel, and you want the industry pushing, right? So I know BIM cares about this and wants to go as fast as possible, but no faster. And you need allies in the industry helping you to get the rest of the machine to go fast, because being in government is like wading through treacle, and you cannot do things without allies, and you need people out there as protagonists, essentially making it easier for you to do the thing you want to do anyway. About 18 months or so ago, before the UK legislation was properly framed, I tried to play this role a little bit when Andrew Griffiths was in that job, and I think he did a very good job. And I got out there and was really aggressively, go, 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 we're going to totally lose out. And I got a load of enthusiastic support, and that was great. But what I was trying to do was just give the ministers space to do what I knew they wanted to do anyway. And in that sense, coming to your first question again, what can you do to speak truth under power? There's often people in the system who want to do what you want them to do, so empower them to do it by giving that voice.
We know from the work that people like Sarah Green have been doing on the Law Commission that what is unusual in this jurisdiction about digital assets is that they're not classed as a currency, not classed as property. What the law is likely to be is that they will be a new asset class.
Yeah.
Now, I agree, it's great to have the regulators here and to get their perspective, but do you think that means we need a different regulator?
No.
Because we're not talking about a financial instrument, we're talking about something different, a third class.
What do we want? A new regulator. When do we want it? No, we really don't. What we want is the common law, right? So in all this discussion, it has been mentioned a couple of times today, but in all this discussion, we talk about the regulators because they are people and they're statutory, but actually the common law is enormously powerful and helpful as a tool. It doesn't get discussed in policy terms because we over in Westminster can't do anything about it unless we really don't like it and are going to essentially overrule it. But the common law is incredibly powerful, and if the common law and the work of the Law Commission leads to a new definition of a type of instrument, then that's something that the regulators should run with. We definitely don't need a new regulator.
Yeah, I think I'd rather agree with that. You agree with
that? I mean, we went through the thinking process at the time, and we looked at the kind of structure we wanted to have, whether it should or shouldn't have, and it was a slam dunk that it would be madness to create a new line of thinking in many areas that are traditional financial services done in a different way. So I agree entirely. I think it's absolutely best left in the hands of the current regulators.
Obviously, it goes without saying, I'm a great fan of the common law, but do you think question to both of you, do you think the existing regulators need to change to make sure this works?
Yes. I think the number one challenge that the FCA in particular has had, and I've had a lot of sympathy for them, has been losing really good people. Yeah. Now they are in the process of restoring that, but they have lost a lot of really good people. It's always a challenge in regulators. The public sector is underpaid compared to the private sector. And there is always people moving from one to the other. And so I think that actually it's one of these areas that investment in capability in the regulator will lead to a far stronger private market. And it's, you've got to see it as a piece of critical infrastructure.
I agree. I mean, we didn't have the expertise when we started. So we brought the expertise in to support the regulator during that time of both drafting the package and then seeing the legislation being implemented with applications coming through and then supervising them. So for us, it took us some time to get up to the level we wanted to be, but we brought it in during that process. I think we've had the same problem of good staff being poached by the private sector, and we've gone through exactly the same process of replacing them, because if you don't have the people, this is all about people, you're never going to get the results you want from them. So critical, absolutely critical.
And Matt, you talked earlier about this jurisdiction being a properly, fully regulated structure. Do you think we can do that without the US?
Yes, we did. We've done it in the past. The Eurobond market I mentioned in the historical analogy, that's actually a much closer analogy to some of the more recent areas of innovation in the UK, like repo, or indeed futures, right, which are essentially started here. And that's because the Eurobond market came here because the US couldn't get its regulatory act together, because it has a so much more complicated regulatory picture. Even within a single state, it's much messier, let alone across all of the states. Whereas we have a well thought through, rational structure of regulation. And so actually, yes, it's an opportunity. It's better than being something we can deal with. Of course, you want international, relatively reasonable levels of international harmony, but we wouldn't want MiFID, and we certainly don't want a retrospective action which creates uncertainty over whether what you do today might be permissible in the future. And then I think we can, in this area, we can lead that for the UK sort of category of countries, and then there'll be others that are more sort of elbows out, go-getting, right? And the UAE have already said that they want to be a major player in this. Singapore have made some significant strides. And that's, I think that's great at a global level. But we have a particular part of the market to play in. And I think if we lose going for the really big, solid top end of the market, then we'd lose out overall.
And slightly more controversially, would you say the same thing about our relationship with Europe? We can do this on our own. We don't need Europe either.
Yeah, sure. And there's a question with MiFID. The EU are now inviting UK organisations to essentially become MiFID compliant, and we see that as at one level that's a competitiveness challenge, but at another that's good for the UK as a place to base your business. So that's a good thing. We'll be far more once we get this right, and so long as there isn't the there isn't undue political pressure and there isn't a political noise, then I think we'll end up with a more flexible, more rational system than MiFID, and a more predictable system than the States, and we've got the common law, and I think the three of those things together is great. One final point on this, which is I really want to pick up on a point that was made earlier when somebody said in one of the panels the public has 0% risk appetite on this. It's just not true, right? LCF, nobody knows what happened. Unless you're in the FCA and you're burned by this, what was supposed to be a terrible crisis, nobody's ever heard of it. Nobody in Westminster knows about it. I've probably got the acronym wrong, right? It's just not important. There is appetite for risk, there's appetite for failure. In the last 2 years, we've had 2 spectacular global level failures within digital assets, and yet here we are again, moving forward, right? That's because that was the system catching up with the old libertarian side. So don't believe it if you think that if you hear that the public doesn't have appetite for risk. They do care about consumer protection for retail customers in the genuine sense. But once you get to a level of sophistication, the public has a really high appetite for risk, and they are not accurately represented by the Daily Mail.
There we go. That's probably right. Albert, similar but slightly different question, because I think the smaller jurisdictions of which Gibraltar is a great example are very often ahead of the curve. Because it's slightly easier to enact and there's less consultation for obvious reasons. But you're never quite completely independent, are you?
Well, I think in terms certainly of this area we are. We've had a wonderful relationship with the UK government, with the Treasury in particular, and with the regulators, where the level of interaction and cooperation between them is really quite extraordinary. The UK would not have agreed for Gibraltar financial services firms to be able to passport into the UK if they didn't have that degree of comfort in the work that we do. And even now, as we come closer to the implementation of GAR, which is the Gibraltar UK regime, passporting, there are now assessments of each of the subsets to ensure that we are properly aligned with the UK. And obviously, that's what we subscribe to, because that's what's going to give us the benefit of being able to access the UK markets. In this particular space, interestingly, talking to one of the points that Matt made, one of the issues that we've had since we've legislated is that firms have got the choice of coming to Gibraltar and being fully regulated, not light touch, not properly regulated, or going somewhere else where you don't have compliance checks, you don't have licensing fees, you don't have supervision from the regulator, and they can reach most of the client base that they can do from us. So the more countries, and this is where the Commonwealth and the modular code for the Commonwealth is important, because we've got to get countries hitting minimum standards as a baseline.
Yeah.
And then if you want to go more than that, then firms can do that. But there's got to be a set of international standards which are the bottom line and deal with AML, deal with all the travel rule of the FATF and everything else. I think without that, we'll struggle. The UK is going to go, I hope, the right way, which I have every confidence they will, and have a fully fledged regulatory system for the sector, which is what I think will enable it to fly.
And if I may say so, it is easier to do that in the UK when places like Gibraltar have already made strides, and we can learn from that here. And then there's other jurisdictions, including in the Commonwealth, that have a much more flexible system. And our job is to learn from all of these.
I agree. I think the sector, the city, the regulators, no one needs to be too proud to learn from much smaller jurisdictions, because a lot of them have got it right. Thank you very much, both of you. That's been a really interesting talk.
Thank you
very much.